Welcome back to America's Sports Car. I'm standing here next to a 2004 Chevrolet Corvette, most specifically the final model year of the C5 generation. I've reviewed a couple Corvettes on my channel, a C4 ZR1 and a 1988 35th Anniversary Edition, both of which are linked on the screen at some point in the video. So I wanted to see where the Corvette went from here when it went into the 21st century. It's well known at this point that the Corvette is America's sports car. And back in 2004, it was still in its basic pure formula of a big V8 engine underneath the hood in front of the driver, sending its power to the rear wheels. And how much power exactly? 350 horsepower from a 5.7 liter V8 that is very famous and well known throughout the world. But we'll look at that engine in a minute. Right now, I want to take in the styling of the C5. I always thought the C5 was the first Corvette generation to start to look exotic. Namely, it's big, it's wide, it's low, and it's red. The Corvette took this exotic design theme and eventually it's manifested itself in the current C8 Corvette, which is the first mid-engine Corvette, if you count mid-engine meaning the engine behind the driver. It's basically designed to look like a Ferrari, and the Z06 and ZR1 sound like Ferraris, and to be honest, go harder than Ferraris. I always thought the C5's design was really well done. It was tastefully exotic, but not over the top. It's still a Corvette through and through. It's still easily distinguishable as America's sports car, but it started to look a little bit more exotic. Also, the C5 had notable chassis upgrades over the C4. It was much more stiff, and that shows through with better handling and better performance on track. Also, it was made to be a little bit easier to live with than the C4. It's more reliable than the C4. The top is much easier to lift out and put in the back, and there's actually a somewhat usable trunk back there. C5s are pretty cheap right now, not as cheap as C4s, but they're getting there. You can find these things easily for $15,000 to $20,000, depending on condition. But if you want to step up to the ultimate C5 Corvette, you could get the Z06, the first regular production Corvette Z06, which started in 2001 and made it through to the end of the C5 lineup here with 2004. In terms of body styles, you could have the Corvette as the regular Targa liftback hatchback, which is what we have here, or you could have a Spider style convertible, which looked really good with the top down. Or if you wanted a more serious, stiff experience, you could get a Corvette hardtop. The hardtop is the body style that was most notably on the Z06. It was the only body style you could get, but you could get it on a regular Corvette. It's quite rare, hard to tell, but you could get a regular Corvette with the hardtop body style. Now, I touched on chassis improvements over the C4 Corvette just a second ago, but it's important to note just how much better the C5 was than the C4. The C5 has a lot of improvements in not just the chassis. It has a center backbone. It has a transaxle, which is a transmission mounted at the back with a torque tube that connects it to the engine. A lot of mechanical stuff that I don't really understand. But the fact is there that the C5 Corvette was 4 times as stiff as the C4, which is a ridiculously large amount. And I think it is the most improved chassis over 2 generations ever in history. So this car is definitely going to leave those C4 Corvettes for dead on a mountain back road. Not only because of its better handling and better chassis, but it also has like 4 times the horsepower as some C4s do. Underneath the hood there is 350 horsepower from the first generation LS engine. Yes, the LS that everybody is swapping into Porsche 911s and cars that weren't ever actually planned to have LS engines. This is where that engine started. And again, we're gonna look at it in just a second. But for now, let's talk on practicality. Now, the C4 has a similar opening hatch to the C5, but what's notable about the C5 is that this door back here is a lot bigger. Also, the button for it is in a more reasonable place by the steering wheel. So open that up, And you can see it is a much larger trunk area back here. You could actually fit not just the top, which is what's back here right now. You can fit your lawn chair back here and a couple of your friends' lawn chairs if they have C3s and they can't fit the lawn chair in the back because it has a non-existent trunk. You can put their lawn chairs, their New Balance shoes, and your Corvette hat, plus all of their Corvette hats back here. So it's a much more practical car than any Corvette that went before. Also, it has this very high quality looking cargo cover, which is just a blanket basically that's draped from the back window. But when you close the trunk here, it covers all of your precious New Balance shoes perfectly fine. Let's step inside. Here we are in the inside of a C5 Corvette, and now it's time to complain. As everybody knows, the interior quality of the C5 Corvette is generally known to be the worst part of it by far. Here's what everyone's talking about. As I look around, I see that this dashboard and this door panel, it's like they didn't even try to match them up. The panel gap is vast. I can stick these two fingers in this panel gap right here. And then there's this dashboard panel that's kind of coming off a little bit below it. That also has a wide panel gap, sits there awkwardly. It's clear that they didn't really design this dashboard panel very well, and they didn't build it very well because, again, panel gaps, plastics everywhere. Everywhere you touch is mostly cheap, nasty General Motors plastic. What isn't plastic are the controls on the door for your windows and mirrors and memory seats, which are rubber. Rubber controls. I mean, I would rather have horrible plastic here because there is one thing that's worse than cheap plastic. If there's anybody that is going to scrape the bottom of the toilet bowl of interior build quality for cars, it's early 2000s General Motors. So they were experimenting to see how much money they could save on every material here. And they put this cheap rubber here, which feels awful. It's disgustingly bad. This door handle here, something you're going to be touching a lot, obviously. Cheap plastic, various different shades of gray, but they did put a C5 Corvette badge right here to distract you from the awful quality, but even that doesn't feel very nice. Furthering the cost-cutting General Motors theme, I direct your attention to the center of the control stack here, and you see the exact same radio and climate control setup that you would have in a Trailblazer, a Chevrolet Cavalier, a Buick Park Avenue, Chevrolet Suburban, literally everything. You have touched these radio controls before and climate controls. I guarantee it. Even if you've never seen a C5 Corvette in your entire life, you have operated these exact climate controls because they are there and they are shared with literally pretty much every single General Motors car. I can't think of a single one that doesn't have this radio setup with the preset buttons in the middle. That setup, clear cost cutting right there. I move down and I see this ashtray, which has a very high quality plastic cover over the top that is easy to operate and doesn't at all feel like I could rip it out with my hands right now if I wanted to, but I'm not going to. And then the best part is this. Is this supposed to be a cup holder, people? I mean, come on. I thought the C4 Corvette had a bad cup holder, but this takes the cake. I mean, that is pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. This is all you get, by the way. All you get. I mean, if you own a C5 Corvette, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be driving to Cars and Coffee with your wife, obviously, and you're going to stop at a Maverick to get a massive Big Gulp style 32-ounce Diet Coke. Where do you put it? Where do you put it in this car? This cup holder, I don't trust it for anything. Like, it is genuinely, I'm saying this, the worst cup holder I have ever laid my eyes upon. It makes the E39 BMW 5 Series cup holders look trustworthy. I'll move on from that and skim over some more bad panel gaps and plastic on the center console over to the 6-speed manual transmission. the C5 Corvette could be ordered with 2 transmission options. If you're a typical Corvette guy with the lawn chair and the New Balance hat, you will probably opt for the 4-speed automatic. But if you want your Corvette as something to drive and really enjoy, you could get the 6-speed manual, which is what I have here. And I have operated Corvette manuals before. This is a lot more like the 6-speed that's in the Corvette ZR1. For all I know, it could be the exact same. And comparing this to the Doug Nash 4+3 manual that was in the '88 Corvette that I reviewed, it's a lot easier to use. This feels like an actual modern sports car transmission. The throws aren't super long like they are in the Doug Nash. It's nicely notchy. It feels not amazing, but it feels easily good enough. Moving back from that, you can see active handling here, which is Corvette's version of traction control. Later Corvettes, I think, had a competitive mode that you could put it into, which was a more like sporty mode for it, I guess. This one is just the traction control. You can turn it on, you can turn it off. And it's nice to have. I mean, in a car with this power, you're starting to get to that point where it can be a little bit too much to handle for some people. So having traction control is a nice addition. Moving from that, you get to the Corvette 4-spoke steering wheel, which I always hated and I thought it was awful. 4-spoke steering wheels in sports cars just don't look good, but they did at least design it so that you could hold it at 9 and 3 for performance driving, totally fine. So it's a workable steering wheel. You look into the gauge cluster and you see 6 gauges, which is nice. There's plenty of information. You've got coolant temperature, oil pressure, battery voltage, and your fuel around the sides, and then in the center you have your tachometer and your speedometer that goes up to 200 miles per hour. Now what's interesting about this speedometer is that if you press this button right here marked E/M, it switches it instantaneously to reading kilometers per hour, which is nice if you often drive your Corvette over the Canadian border. I don't know of anybody who ever does that, but it's nice to have. And like I said, it does it instantly. You'll be driving around at 60 miles an hour. You press that button and immediately the needle shoots up to 100. It's really cool and a fun little gimmick. There's also buttons around the outside that you can press to give yourself information, your trip, options, which is sort of a precursor to what cars have now with digital gauge clusters and giving you all sorts of different information. You have that. On the left, you have a strange button setup that says display, page, and a little slider that ends in off. And what that is the first heads-up display that was in the Corvette, and it's one of the first heads-up displays ever put in any car. And it's actually very useful, more useful than you'd think. Right now I'm looking at it and it's reading my speed and tachometer, which is what you want for your performance driving. It gives you all the essential information that you want, and you can adjust it up and down with this display button. And if you press page, it gives you some various different information, like what you have on these outside auxiliary gauges here. So that's really cool, and that's really ahead of its time. This car is 20 years old. It's almost old enough to drink, okay? And it's got a heads-up display, and that is very cool. And I think it's there to distract yourself from the awful build quality of this interior. Speaking on comfort, I'm 6'3", I'm quite tall. I would like to move this seat down a little bit more than it goes. I do feel like I'm sitting quite high, and honestly, I think I fit a little bit better, at least my upper body fits a little bit better in the C4 Corvette. In that car, you sit right on the ground and it feels really special. I don't think the C5 Corvette's driving position matches the sporty feel and special feel of the C4 because you sit quite high up, which I'm not a huge fan of. I can move my seat up more if I want. There's like no adjustment actually. I can move the seat up and down like an inch, but I can move the seat back farther than I can in the C4. So if you've got long legs, you'll be totally fine. Also, this steering wheel right here is tilting manually, which is kind of weird because it has a telescoping function with this switch here that's electric. So most of the driving position for most people in the C5 Corvette is an improvement over the C4, especially this floor right here. In the C4, they had to raise the sills underneath the doors a lot higher to strengthen it because the chassis was sort of bad. And the footwell in the C4 is notorious for being horribly narrow, and getting in and out of that car isn't easy. The C5 thankfully addresses all of these things. It's easy to get in and out, and I actually have room for my feet, which is nice. And when my left foot isn't on the clutch, there is a dead pedal to rest it on. So in terms of 95% of the driving position and comfort up here, it is a large improvement over the C4. As you can see, we're at the front of the C5 Corvette. Now, it's worth noting, it is one of 2 of the last cars ever to have pop-up headlights. This and the Lotus Esprit ended production at the exact same time, basically. So 2004 Corvette, this is the most modern, newest car, unless you count the Lotus Esprit, that you can find with pop-up headlights. I look in there and I see the LS1. This is the world famous 5.7 liter V8 that you can find in pretty much everything now. Because of its compact design that packs a lot of power, you can pretty much easily swap this into Porsche 911s, BMWs, all sorts of things that aren't Corvettes have these LS engines in them. The LS went through lots of different configurations, but this is number 1. It develops 350 horsepower, and I can't remember how much torque. That'll be down there. So as an LS engine goes, it's a little bit underpowered, but again, it was the first one. And it's worth noting that, look at this, it's an LS in the car that's supposed to have the LS. 350 horsepower is right about the number that I would want to stay with a car that I'm driving on the roads, because you can just about have fun with it at 10/10ths and not go to jail. When you get above 300, 400, 500 horsepower, you can't really open it up whenever you please, unless you're making sure that there are no cops around. That's enough talking. I think it's time we take this C5 Corvette out on the road, see how it drives. Time to take the C5 out for a drive. Nothing beats the sound of an LS V8 coming to life. I mentioned the C4 Corvette quite a lot in this video for a couple good reasons. Number 1, the C4 was the predecessor to this car, so it's worth talking about how it improved. And 2, the C4 is the only other Corvette that I've ever driven. So yeah, I've driven 2 C4s, once again, 88 35th anniversary edition and the ZR1. And I will say, among other improvements with the chassis and the powertrain, this C5 is so much easier to drive than the C4 is. The C4, you really have to work, especially with that Doug Nash 4+3. You have to throw it into gear because the gear shifter is so tight and mechanical feeling, but also the throws are like ridiculously long. You really have to put in some serious effort to drive that car. This thing, you could drive it every day, no problem. I mean, it's really not that hard to drive. I'm gonna be one of those people for the sake of better audio. When it comes to driving experience, not just dynamics, but dailyable use, the C5 trumps the C4 in every measure. I mean, it's not even a competition. But I will say, the C4, with that driving position, those digital gauges you get, and the fact that it was harder to drive made it feel so much more special. And that's why I think I still want one of them. But maybe a quick poll will convince me otherwise. Let's see how this LS feels. Whoa! Yeah, it's more powerful and faster than than most C4s. That is for certain. And that cup holder couldn't hold on to my Red Bull, so I had to save it. Very last second I thought they would have done better with the cup holders on the C5, but no, they did far worse somehow. So yeah, power, over the C4. That's definitely an improvement. What about handling? Oh yeah. It feels so much more direct and predictable than the C4. The steering feels better, the brakes feel better, the chassis feels better. Everything about this car in terms of dynamics and comfort is an improvement over the C4, definitely, 100%. Sound is also an improvement. And it is nice that taking the top out doesn't compromise on your structure. And I forgot to mention, another thing is the top in this car is so much easier to remove and put back than in the C4. Removing the Targa top on this car is an easy process. One latch back there, one latch here, and then one latch on the other side, and you're good to go. Stow the top in the back, you're done. If you're a C4 owner and you happen to leave your special top wrench at home, you're out of luck. In that car, you have to undo 4 bolts. It takes a while. If it suddenly starts raining really hard, you're gonna be unhappy as you're putting the top back in, because that top is actually part of the structure and it had to be really bolted in place. I think that's why. So yeah, there's improvements all around when it comes to the C5 easily. But do I like it more than the C4? I don't know. Something about it just doesn't feel as special to me. I don't know what it is. I can't place my finger on it, but something about that C4 feels a little bit more special. I think it's the driving position and how you have to work a little bit harder to drive that car. This car is something you could daily drive, totally fine. I'm really happy to have had this opportunity to drive a C5 Corvette. I will say, I think I still want a C4 more though, but I'm glad that I had this chance to drive one. So yeah, all you C5 Corvette fanatics, I hope I did your car justice. It's great, it's a lot of fun. So with that being said, I'm gonna end that video there. Like, subscribe, do all the normal YouTube stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.